You are watching GrassRoots Community Television, helping you make television people watch everywhere. Broadcasting on cable channel 82 in Glenwood Springs and Carbondale, and channel 12 in Aspen, Snowmass, Basalt, and Elgibel. Free over-the-air broadcasts throughout the Roaring Fork Valley. All programs can be watched anytime, anywhere at grassrootstv.org.
Well, good evening, everybody. Thanks so much for coming out to our Naturalist Nights speaker series. As you probably know, the Wilderness Workshop hosts this series with the Roaring Fork Audubon Society and the Aspen Center for Environmental Studies. I guess I'll just begin by saying we're really excited about the series this year. We've got a bunch of, I think, pretty exciting talks coming up. We've got the director of the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab is coming over later in the year, and we've had Rod Nash was here earlier in the season. So we've got a bunch of good talks. Also this year, almost all of our talks are being taped by GrassRoots TV, which is great because if folks miss it, it'll be available on the television or on their website or our website afterwards. So if you miss something, you can come see it later on. To let you know, next week, the show will be just up in Aspen, and that'll be a guy named Jeff Deems, who's a professor at the University of Colorado, and he'll be talking about climate change, dust on snow, and beetles, and kind of the impacts on hydrology in the upper Colorado River Basin. And then following that, back down here, will be a presentation on weather forecasting and looking at a guy who spent a bunch of time forecasting powder in Colorado. So if you're interested in skiing, come down for that. I'm going to pass this sign-up sheet around. If you could just put your name on it, even if you're already on it, it helps us keep track of how many folks showed up. And then I'll introduce Erik Molvar, our presenter tonight. And Erik is a conservation biologist and is also the director of the Biodiversity Conservation Alliance, which is located in Laramie, Wyoming. He's spent about 12 years working on oil and gas issues as part of his conservation career. He's also a fairly prolific author. He's written a dozen guidebooks to a lot of wilderness areas, including the Maroon Bell Snowmass right in our backyard. And he's got a new book on Wyoming's Red Desert, which is this desert country just north of Craig. And so after the show, if you want to get him to sign you a copy, he's got some available for sale back there. I guess with that, I'll invite Erik to come up and tell us about oil and gas in Wyoming. It's great to have him down here because, as you guys know, the workshop does a fair bit of work on oil and gas, and a lot of times we're kind of looking to our neighbors up in Wyoming to see what's happened up there. They've in some ways gone before us a bit, but I think there's a bunch of lessons to be learned from both the work with industry and sometimes the work against industry, as Erik will talk about. Some of the practices can be pretty damaging, and we're starting to feel the effects right in our backyard, so it's a good lesson for us. Thanks, Erik.
Well, thanks, Will. And as Will mentioned, I work for Biodiversity Conservation Alliance, which is a nonprofit advocacy group that works to protect wildlife and wild places in Wyoming and in surrounding states. And I'm also our kind of main oil and gas guy, so it's kind of appropriate that I'm bringing you this presentation. We're on the West, how the oil industry is carving up our last best places. You know, when I started working as a professional conservationist in 2000, really oil and gas development wasn't such a big deal and wasn't such a big threat. And at that point, the well fields were small, the impacts were minor, they weren't having major, massive, widespread impacts on wildlife or public lands, and as a consequence, the conservation community really wasn't keyed into oil and gas, didn't know how to engage with the issue, didn't know that much about the industry and its technologies and its capabilities, and we really weren't ready for what was about to happen to us. And then, of course, later on in 2000 was the election of George W. Bush, and that changed everything. Because what happened is you had a White House that was filled with oil industry executives. You had George W. Bush, a former owner of Arbusto Petroleum in Texas. We had Dick Cheney, the vice president, who came out of Wyoming from an oil industry family, who was on the board of Halliburton. And in the Interior Department, we had Gail Norton, the Interior Secretary from here in Colorado, who was the former head of Mountain States Legal Foundation, which was the biggest anti-environment law firm in the country and representing the oil industry quite a bit. And her big assistant, who was in charge of the Assistant Secretary of Lands and Minerals, was Stephen Griles. And he was a coal bed methane industry lobbyist who worked quite a bit in Wyoming. So they stacked the deck, did the oil industry, throughout Washington. All the positions of power, all the levers of power were being controlled by oil industry executives, former lobbyists, and whatnot. And they ruled the roost. And they wasted no time in getting down to business. Now, this is the state of Wyoming you're looking at here. And each little pinpoint, the size of a pinhead, is one oil and gas well. And this is as of about 2009. And as you can see, there are entire areas of Wyoming. Look at the northeast part of Wyoming here. This is the Powder River Basin, a major coal bed methane play. All of those little dots came to be drilled after the year 1999. All of those thousands of wells. If you look down here in the southern part of the state, this is the Red Desert. You see this area has about 6,000 wells in it at this point. Heavily expanded between 2000. This is the Continental Divide Creston project, which was begun in the year 2000. Basically, there was nothing out here before then. This is an area that was 6 million acres, didn't really even have major dirt roads in it, just basically Jeep trails everywhere. And in the course of a decade, it became heavily industrialized. And you can see some of these dark patches here. You have the Pinedale Anticline, which was begun in 2000, the Jonah Field, which was begun in 1999, and you have the LaBarge Field, which was really the only large field that existed before the year 2000 in the state, and the Moxa Arch immediately to the south of it. So those are the big fields in the state of Wyoming. As you can see, Wyoming is one of the leaders in fossil fuel development. In fact, the state of Wyoming, one state out of 50, produces 3% of the world's carbon emissions are mined or drilled out of the ground in Wyoming. That's one state. We are the biggest net carbon exporter of any state in the country. So this became ground zero. We got to learn about oil and gas first, and we got to be run over by the truck first. And so we got the license plate and told our friends in Colorado how to deal with it once we picked ourselves up off the pavement. And if you look throughout the West, this is a fairly recent look at where oil and gas leases are found in the West. And as you see, you have blue leases, which are actually held by production in areas like northwest New Mexico. There's some in western Colorado, a bunch in the Powder River Basin, and some in the Red Desert and in the Upper Green Valley. But this is the minority of the leases that are out there. And a lot of times you hear the oil industry complaining, oh, gee, they're shutting down our leases. We can't get at the natural gas and the oil that's out there. Our country's energy future is at stake here, and we can't get at the gas that we have here in the United States. Well, the truth is that they have twice as much leases that are out there already under their ownership that they could go drill if they do their due diligence, but they want to sprawl themselves even farther over our public lands in the West, kind of like a grizzly bear sprawling over a carcass, so they can control as much land as possible before somebody like the conservation community comes along and says, hey, wait a minute, maybe we should have more balanced development, more limited development, staged development, something like that that limits their ability to have unfettered access to these fossil fuel resources. And you, of course, we've had a lot of evidence of how dirty the oil and gas industry is. We had a big oil spill in the Gulf out in that BP had a couple of years ago. There was another big oil spill up in Montana where a refinery pipeline lost lots of gallons of oil into the Yellowstone River. We're pretty well aware of how dirty a business the oil industry really is, but it's always trying to paint itself as being clean and progressive and green. And if you watch the TV commercials that you often see, they often talk about how much they love wildlife and how much they care about wildlife. And so here we're going to do a little bit of fact-checking and myth-busting about the oil and gas industry in this presentation. But the bottom line is it's a dirty business. And we'll start with conventional oil drilling. And this is where it all began in the 1800s with oil drilling. And the first wells in Wyoming were drilled in the 1800s. But In the West today, the oil boom is over. We're pretty much out of the oil that's readily, technologically extractable from the ground at this point. We're going after the dregs of the fields that we really pumped out in the 60s and 70s, going after a few extra percent using enhanced oil recovery, pumping foams underground, carbon dioxide underground, pumping water underground, trying to chase that last little bit of oil up through the pipes and produce it. Most of these oil wells in places like Wyoming and western Colorado are what are called stripper wells at this point. And what that means is the big companies that came in and drilled them have sold them off to mid-level independent companies, and they've in turn sold them off to individuals and speculators who will operate these oil wells sometimes at rates of 25 to a few hundred gallons or a few hundred barrels per month. I mean, they really don't produce that much. We're about out in the United States. The oil industry likes to talk about drilling in the West and drilling in the United States in general as being part of our nation's energy security and trying to get us off our addiction to foreign oil, specifically Middle Eastern oil. But the fact is, we don't have the oil anymore. We're done. What we have out there that they're drilling for today is natural gas. And natural gas, you can't go to the filling station and put it in your car unless you have a specially modified vehicle, which most of us don't. And so really, these are two completely different markets, two completely different kinds of a resource, and they're pretty much unrelated. The world has a world oil market that goes across international boundaries and fluctuates according to the world economy. Natural gas, by contrast, is a continental market. In other words, we don't have a lot of liquid natural gas terminals at our ports to either bring natural gas into this country or export it out. So what we have on this continent is what we have to burn. And there are a lot of people, I'm included, that heat their house with natural gas and or cook their food on natural gas, and it's billed as a clean energy alternative. But really, when you look at it from cradle to grave, it's not that clean. Sure, at the end of the tailpipe, if you measure the amount of carbon that's put out or the amount of other pollutants that's put out at the end of the tailpipe, you find that it has lower pollution rates and lower carbon emissions at the end of the tailpipe. But if you trace that natural gas back through its whole life cycle, every time they drill a well, they're venting and flaring natural gas. That's a big pollution output. Every time they run a compressor station, that's diesel that's being burned to push that through the pipeline. Every time they put in a pipeline, there are leaks throughout the system that are losing this natural gas as methane into the atmosphere, and natural gas is 23 times as potent as carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. So when it goes into the atmosphere, it causes some really big problems. When you add up those life cycle impacts of natural gas, what you will find is it is every bit as dirty as coal from either a global warming perspective or an air pollution perspective. It's not a clean alternative. It's just as bad. It's a dirty fossil fuel. But the natural gas market, being a continental market, is inherently vulnerable to booms and busts. And the reason is simple. With natural gas, it comes out of the ground, it goes into a pipeline, it goes to your house. It's a direct line. Now, they do have a few places in Louisiana called salt domes where you can pump it underground and store it for a while. That storage is limited. So when everybody's drilling like crazy, like they were in 2005, those salt domes were filling up. And at some point, those salt domes are full and there's nowhere else to put the natural gas. So what happens? Natural gas prices crater and they go down. And when the natural gas prices crater and go down, the companies stop drilling. They take the wells that they're already producing and they shut them in because they don't want to sell their gas at the low prices. They want to hold out for higher prices. And then, at that point, the country is using its storage reserves of natural gas out of these salt domes, depleting the salt domes, and at some point, the salt domes are basically running dry, and then the price of natural gas spikes again. Well, if you're a community out in the western Colorado or in Wyoming, and you're relying on the natural gas industry for a significant portion of your jobs base, what you're going to experience is, when gas prices are high, you're going to have a rush of oil and gas workers into your community busting out at the seams in terms of infrastructure, in terms of rental properties, and you're going to be overrun by all these oil and gas workers, and your community's not going to have the infrastructure they need to handle it. And they're going to, so the communities have to work to build up the infrastructure to handle this big influx of newcomers. And then as soon as they've got it just about taken care of, the whole thing busts. And then the communities are left holding the bag on some very expensive infrastructure that they have to keep paying for but they don't have a tax base to pay for it with anymore. So this is the boom and bust economy of natural gas, and there's really no way to dampen that boom and bust, short of having liquefied natural gas terminals to move things in and out of the country, which is something which has all kinds of problems in its own right. So those are kind of the conventional kinds of oil and gas drilling in the West. But more and more today, we're moving to what are called the unconventional plays, the resource plays. And tight sandstone and tight shale are kind of the first one that I want to talk about. This is the Jonah Field, one of the first big fields. And tight sandstones and tight shales for gas were basically discovered and became productive because of hydraulic fracking. Before hydraulic fracking, there were 3 wells drilled in this field, and they were unproductive, so they shut them in. Then the oil and gas industry decided that, or discovered how they could fracture the rock using various chemicals under high pressure to create spider web of fractures that can draw the gas toward the wellbore. And all of a sudden, places like the Jonah Field here became very, very productive. And this Jonah Field has an estimated 11 to 13 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. That's half the nation's gas supply for a year. That's a lot. It's worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $150 to $175 billion, depending on the fluctuations in the price of natural gas. So we're talking big money here when these discoveries got made. If you look out on the eastern seaboard, out in the Appalachians, the Marcellus tight shale play is very similar. That's a shale play that was tight. And when I say tight, the rock is basically the consistency of concrete. There are no pores in it. If you're a geologist, it's a porosity of less than 0.1 millidarcy. But what it really means is you can't move that gas anywhere. So you can drill a wellbore into it, but the gas is stuck in the rock. So if it doesn't get fractured, it can't be produced. Once the fracking was discovered, that really took off in terms of these shale plays all over the country. The Marcellus in the Appalachians, the Barnett shales down in the Fort Worth area. There are shale plays throughout Wyoming. And basically, for us Westerners, you can look all the way from Yellowstone down to northwestern New Mexico, and there are tight shales and tight sandstone formations that are extant beneath all of these areas throughout the West that are just waiting to be tapped. And in Silk, Colorado, you have some tight sandstone and tight shale plays that are already happening. And you see this kind of ultra-dense drilling like you have in the Jonah Field. And the argument is we have to put so many well bores down so close together because our fractures have to virtually touch, otherwise we can't produce all the gas there. So we have to have this massive surface footprint that essentially destroys the value of the land for any other use, whether it's livestock, wildlife, public recreation. Those go by the board, and the landscape becomes a single-use landscape. Coal bed methane was one that was discovered in the late 1990s, and it taps coal seams. And coal bed methane originally was a waste product. And in the coal mines of West Virginia, they had this stuff, and it caused mine fires and explosions in these mines because the coal is saturated with these methane gas that comes off the coal as it becomes dewatered. And that methane gas floats around, and if you have a spark, you have an explosion. And so you hear about these mine disasters in the anthracite mines of West Virginia. That's all because of this coal bed methane. It was originally drilled to try and get rid of this coal bed methane for mine safety. But then later the industry discovered, lo and behold, this methane is basically the same as natural gas. And they started going after it in a big bad way. And one of these slides up here in the top right corner here is kind of an ironic one. This is from the Powder River Basin, which is huge in coal bed methane. And it says, coal bed methane development ahead, proceed with caution. Well, that's not what they did. What they did is they went in with about 20,000 wells right out of the gate. And when coal bed methane, if you're trying to produce it, it is stuck to the coal under pressure of water. And imagine a bottle of Pepsi, and you're sitting there, and this bottle of Pepsi, you know it's carbonated, but you can't see any bubbles. Then you crack the top off that bottle of Pepsi, and the bubbles start coming to the surface because the pressure is released, and the carbon dioxide can bubble its way up. This is exactly the same thing that you get with coal bed methane. Once you pump out the water and release that water pressure, the coal bed methane dehisces from the coal, and it becomes free to migrate just about anywhere. And it can come out at the surface of the ground, or it can come out at your wellbore, and you can produce it as natural gas. But you have millions of gallons of wastewater for each of these wells. And we're talking tens of thousands of wells in a place like the Powder River Basin, and you have nowhere to put it. And the bad news is much of this wastewater is really, really salty. about the consistency of seawater. So it's really toxic to your stream systems. So in the Powder River Basin, they pumped out millions of gallons of this toxic wastewater. They built thousands and thousands of little reservoirs to infiltrate it into the groundwater. They killed off thousands of acres of cottonwoods by flooding them. And they killed off basically the entire native fish fauna of the Powder River in doing this. So it was a giant environmental disaster, and it was all tied to this unique impact that they never tried to handle before, which is what do you do with these millions of gallons of salty wastewater? Now, oil shale is something that you've probably heard of and will be hearing of a lot more, because the federal government right now is trying to decide whether and how much oil shale to list or to make available for oil and gas, for oil shale leasing on a commercial scale. And oil shale is the single dirtiest of the fossil fuels. And I don't know if he's still in here, but Randy Udall, right from this valley, is probably one of the world's experts from an environmental perspective on oil shale. And about most of what I learned and know about oil shale, I learned from Randy. He's a really intelligent guy who's really on it. But oil shale underlies northeastern Utah, northwestern Colorado, and up into Wyoming. And there's basically two ways to get at this stuff. In Estonia, which is where this photo is from, you can strip mine it. And you can mine it out, and then you can put it in what's called a retort, which is basically a big smelter. And oil shale actually is neither oil nor shale. It's what's called kerogen, which is a pre-oil precursor that, if you had millions of years of heat and pressure, would ultimately turn into oil. And the shale is not actually shale, it's a marlstone. So what you must do is you must cook this stuff in order to turn it into some sort of oil-like product, which you can then refine in this retorting process. It takes a tremendous amount of energy on both the mining side and the retorting side, so that the net amount of energy you end up with is fairly negligible. And the impacts are massive. For these retorts, you typically, for a commercial oil shale operation, operating at a scale that would put a significant amount of oil on the market, you need basically a utility scale coal-fired power plant to supply all the electricity that you'd need for that kind of an operation. And all that coal being burned and all that pollution going up into the sky and all that carbon dioxide being produced is in addition to the pollution and the carbon dioxide you're going to produce once you burn the oil shale that you manage to get and refine. So this is a really dirty item. It takes massive amounts of water, estimates anywhere from 3 gallons of water per gallon produced of oil shale. We're out in the arid West here, people. We don't have a lot of water to spare. But this is an industry, if it ever takes off, it's going to take an immense amount of water, and it's going to take it out of the amount of water that's out there now. They're not creating any more water in the Colorado River system, but the oil industry, because of prior appropriations of water and the amount of money that they have, they're going to walk around and they're going to buy up the most senior water rights so they make sure they have guaranteed access to the water. And that means that there's going to be calls on the river. There are going to be agricultural water users that aren't able to use water sources that they've used for a century or more, because now their water is being diverted to oil shale production because they've gone in and bought an older, earlier water right. That's in our future if we have large-scale oil shale production. And of course, the other way to produce oil shale is the new experimental in situ method, which is this bottom photograph. And this is the Mahogany Ridge test facility in Colorado. And Shell has been on and off trying to get this thing to work. The idea is you take the area that you want to produce for oil shale, you bulldoze the entire area that gets produced into a flat well pad, you drill a bunch of freeze wall holes around the outside so that you can put chemicals into the ground to lower the temperature around the edge so that when you heat up this oil shale in the ground, it doesn't escape out of your production site. And once you've got this freeze wall in place and theoretically maintained, then you drill holes into the ground and you put basically the equivalent of electric curling irons in the ground to heat it up with all that electricity to turn it into a liquid form. And then you drill other holes to produce the wells or to produce the oil shale and pump it out. And so what you have is a density of wells on this one massive well pad. And this is just a tiny experimental model that they have here. But the well density is about 1 well per every 10 feet. So what you can see is here also, it's not much better than strip mining for the land because you have 100% flattening and bulldozing of any acre that you want to produce for oil shale. So it's a disaster that I hope is not in the making. There has never been any commercial oil shale operation anywhere in the world to produce a petroleum product. In Estonia, they're using it to burn the rock in a basically equivalent of a coal-fired power plant. And that's what they're doing because they're so resource poor in that country that they're just burning the rock for electricity. But they don't even try to make oil and gas out of it for petroleum products. So this is something that's very unproven, which has always had a history of failure. A number of you are probably old-timers from Western Colorado and may remember Black Sunday from the early 1980s, 1982, when Exxon and their cohorts pulled out and left everybody in Western Colorado holding the bag, and it was a big bust. Hopefully we won't get built up to a big bust this time. We'll be smart enough to give that one a miss. And then tar sands is also part of this new federal leasing initiative because there are tar sands in Utah. And these are tar sands up in Canada. And you guys have probably all heard about the Keystone XL pipeline and why it's such an environmental disaster. And the reason is it's subsidizing this kind of complete landscape destruction up in the Canadian boreal forest, where they're basically scalping the forest, strip mining these massive quantities of oil sands, and then producing this what's called bitumen, which is a very dense stuff. It's almost like liquid asphalt, and it creates a very low-grade oil. And then refining that into something that you could put in your car. There's no percentage in it environmentally, also very dirty. Maybe a lower carbon footprint than oil shale, but not by much, and definitely something that we don't want to see coming to the west. Now, oil and gas has a number of different kinds of environmental impacts, and let's start with air pollution issues. Here are two photographs of wells that are in the process of what's called flaring. Now, when the well is being drilled and before the pipelines are hooked up, you have a lot of natural gas that is of its own pressure coming out of the well bore. You have two choices of what to do. You can vent it into the air, or you can flare it. You can burn it off. And mostly they like to burn it off. Either of them are a disaster. There's also a third option called green completions, which are used less than 5% of the time, where they actually hook up a system to capture that resource so that you can actually use the resource, which is valuable, in addition to the fact that releasing it or burning it has major environmental impacts. But most companies don't do that because it's more expensive, and it's all about the bottom line. So this flaring, this is actually a fracking operation here, and they do this flaring during fracking here. And you can see they're putting thousands of cubic feet of natural gas per minute, burning it up into the atmosphere, while these frack trucks are busy pumping the fracking fluid down into the hole and fracturing that sandstone. And so that's a major impact on air pollution. This one on the top left is in the Pinedale area where they've had major issues. And indeed, ozone being perhaps the most notable of those. In Pinedale, Wyoming, which had as close to pristine air quality as you could possibly find in the United States 10 years ago, we now have days where we have air pollution that is worse than Los Angeles. We are violating EPA standards for ozone, and it's directly because of the natural gas drilling immediately upwind in the Jonah and Pinedale anticline fields. And ozone comes out of a lot of different sources. Every time you run a compressor or a dehydrator or a drilling rig, you're going to produce some ozone. But the bigger source, perhaps, is that when you're pulling waste products like water and liquid petroleum products out of the gas well, and you have to get them out of the pipeline or they clog things up, and you put them in what are called condensate tanks because it condenses into a liquid. And these are vented to the open atmosphere. And so all of these volatile organic compounds, these complex carbon-based molecules, are wafting off of these condensate tanks, and you can actually see them with an infrared camera. You can see them. It looks like a smoke plume coming out. And these are what are called ozone precursors. When sunlight hits these volatile organic compounds, it breaks them down, and one of the major byproducts is ozone. Why is ozone a problem? Well, if you have asthma or emphysema or any other kind of lung problem, and you have a high level of ozone, you're going to have major problems. You're going to have attacks. There are times when there are advisories in Pinedale, and they tell everybody, stay indoors because it's not safe to go outside for extended periods of time. Kids can't go out and play. That's how bad it's getting in some of these places. So not a trivial problem in terms of air quality in some parts of the West. And of course, along with oil and gas development, it's not just drilling, but there are all kinds of ancillary impacts. And if you're going to produce a product, you're going to have to move it to market, and pipelines are a major part of that, and they have impacts of their own. And of course, I talked to you a little bit about these major compressor stations, which are also big sources of pollution. And you create these big linear disturbances that you have from these pipelines where you basically have to, well, you don't have to, but they do out of convenience, bulldoze up a 100-foot right-of-way and then trench out a 6-foot deep trench to lay the pipeline. And then they disc it and they drop some native seeds on it and they walk away and forget about it. And they don't water it, which you'd have to do if you wanted those native seeds to germinate, because most of the time the native seeds would have germinated during wet years only, and during dry years there might not have been any seedling production. But you know, these natural gas producers and oil producers aren't so worried about that. They just want to throw out the seeds and forget about it and say, we checked off our box on reclamation, so you know, whatever we get, we get. And most of the time what you get is noxious weeds, because in disturbed sites, what is the best, most adapted kind of plant? It's usually a kind of plant that's really adapted to disturbed sites. And these are usually kind of weeds that often come from other continents, things like cheatgrass, things like Dalmatian toadflax, and other things. Kochia is a big one that show up, Canadian thistle in these strips, and basically take over. And then once they do take over, it's very hard for the native vegetation to get reestablished. So that can be an issue from a vegetation standpoint. These pipelines can be major corridors where not only can noxious weeds get started along the corridors, but then they start working their way out into areas that are overgrazed that are next to the pipeline. Traffic and dust seems like a pretty minor concern, but in fact, when you look at traffic and dust and you actually evaluate what the impact of that is, for the Atlantic Rim Coal Bed Methane Project, which represents all these photos, we're from that project, they estimated that 30% of the forage for livestock was going to get lost because of the dust settling adjacent to the roads. 30% loss of productivity. And that same forage is also the forage that's supporting your mule deer and your elk and all your other grazers as well, that are the bottom of the food chain, that are supporting all of your predators. So you're having this massive impact at the very bottom of the food web that is then going to cascade upward from this traffic and dust. Another impact of having the traffic is that any kind of wildlife species that is sensitive to human presence or is hunted is going to flee away from traffic. So the more traffic you have, the less wildlife you have. They abandon the areas next to the roads, even if they're otherwise suitable habitat. And finally, you can have basically a form of dust emphysema that cattle and wildlife will get from having all this dust in the air. It's basically silicosis that miners used to get, but it's a form that the livestock will get, and it will cause them health problems and to lose weight, and then they become more vulnerable to any disease or malnutrition that might be facing them. So all kinds of problems with traffic and dust that you might not otherwise consider such a big issue. A lot of times with these oil and gas fields, you get power lines being built, and above ground power lines are particularly a problem, mostly because they are raptor perching platforms. And here you can see a golden eagle that's perching on this power pole here. And when you put these power lines, through a habitat for, say, sage grouse or prairie dogs or another species that is a prey species for hawks and eagles, then you're creating a perfect opportunity for those hawks and eagles to concentrate their predation efforts right in the most vulnerable areas. And so it's really bad for things like sage grouse and prairie dogs. So power lines can be a big issue. You can bury the power line. It does cost more. We are almost never successful in getting them to do it. Then before you even get started with oil and gas drilling and bulldozing, there's what's called seismic exploration or geophysical exploration, and they use what are called thumper trucks. And these vehicles weigh 64,000 pounds. Now, on our BLM lands, you and I are not allowed to drive our pickup truck off of existing roads. A pickup truck weighs 4,000 pounds. Yet, these 32-ton monster trucks go four in a formation in straight lines across whatever's in their path. If it's sensitive riparian vegetation, they plow through it. If it's juniper woodlands, like you can see in this photo from Utah, they plow over it. They basically run roughshod across the landscape in a grid pattern, and then every 375 feet, these thumper trucks will lower a pad in the middle, and they will lift up the entire weight of the truck, and they will vibrate. And they will send vibrations down into the earth. They get reflected back from oil and gas deposits like sonar and get picked up by these little things called geophones that are stretched in alternate lines along the area. And so this can be a major impact in terms of creating linear disturbances that are really obvious to the eye, These look basically like somebody went through with a giant plow and plowed up a row of furrows through the sagebrush. And then those particular lines can then become travel corridors for things like coyotes and other predators. And so if you move these things through, say, a sage-grouse fleck where they're breeding, or a prairie dog colony where they're concentrated, then you're just kind of creating a superhighway for the predators to get to their prey base and have an unfair advantage in taking them down. You're basically creating an imbalance in nature when you do that. Another issue that is little understood is methane seeps. And this is from the Atlantic Rim Coal Bed Methane Project, and we had a fellow by the name of Walt Mershott, who's in the bottom two photographs. We brought him in. He's an expert. He started working in 1967 for the oil and gas industry, going all over the world looking for these methane seeps to try and find oil and gas deposits underneath. And methane is, again, natural gas. 85% of natural gas is methane. And so this is the Atlantic Rim, where the coal bed methane deposits are at a slant like this, and they crop out at the surface. So what they're doing is they're drilling down, and they're pumping out the water, which makes the methane want to escape and go wherever it can go. Well, some of it's going to the wellbore, but some of it is going to the surface. And these are the largest methane seeps that Mr. Mershott had ever seen in his career, going all over the world. And it was because basically they were dewatering these coal seams. The edges of the coal seams were exposed to the surface. The coal bed methane was going straight up through, in this case, springs and waterways. And we're talking about thousands of cubic feet per minute on each of these things. And if you had the guts to throw a match in there, you would create a fire plume that would be about 20 feet high from each of these. Now, the tricky part is, this is where the methane seeps are happening in areas that have water. This is out in the Red Desert. There's not much water out there. So for every one of these that's in a water area, there are probably 20 or 30 of them that are popping up in areas that have no water. Well, guess what? Natural gas is odorless. When the gas company puts it in the line, they put a particular odor-causing agent in your gas so you can smell it when you have a leak. But when it's natural, it has no odor, and it has no taste, and you can't see it. It's invisible. So if you happen to be out there hunting, and you have your hunting camp, and you have your wall tent, and you fire up your stove to cook up your Spam, and you happen to be over one of these things, you're going to go boom. These are major, major safety concerns. And in addition to the fact of these are major, major amounts of resource that the companies were counting on getting into their profit line that are going straight in the atmosphere, becoming global warming agents. So this is a big waste on a couple different levels, but a major problem nonetheless that you will have in places where you have coal bed methane production. There's a place I hear in southwestern Colorado called Dead Mouse Pass, where it's not in a water area, but it's a methane seep, and it's basically killed all the rodents. So water quality problems, we talked a little bit about coal bed methane. This is an outfall from a well that was a conventional oil well. It was actually the one that you saw a picture of earlier out in the southwestern corner of the Powder River Basin. And we happened to stumble upon this during a wilderness inventory. And here you see the outfall of the water, and it's water contaminated with oil, which is that black slick. And as you see in the top of the photograph, that is a stream and a wetland where this is going. And it's just being blithely pumped out in the stream in the wetland. And there are laws against this. But in Wyoming, there are about 8 guys in the Department of Environmental Quality's Water Quality Division. And they're all sitting at a desk because they have so much permitting to do that nobody gets out to see, except the guys that work for the oil and gas companies. Well, are they going to report this sort of thing? Probably not. In this case, they certainly hadn't. So we happened to stumble upon this. We reported it. The company was issued a notice of violation and a fine. And they were out there. I was out there the next week, and they were out there with a pump truck cleaning it up. But that's only the one that I saw. How many of the ones that are doing this are not being seen by anyone? We don't know the answer to that. And there is kind of a shoot, shovel, and shut up attitude in the oil patch out there that basically says, well, we're going to kind of try and ignore this problem until somebody comes along and forces us to do something about it. And there simply aren't enough warm bodies in the conservation movement or the federal and state regulatory agencies to keep an eye on all of these wells. In Wyoming, we have more than 100,000 right now. You just can't watch them all the time, and that's a problem. So it leads to water quality problems. And this is an example of salty discharge from coal bed methane development. Now, I talked about how in the Powder River Basin, some of the water that was so salty, it was about like seawater. Here in the Atlantic Rim Coal Bed Methane Project, it's 3 times as salty as that. And as you see in this photograph, you have in the background here, this is a dam of a reservoir. And when this project was approved, the Bureau of Land Management told us this reservoir will contain 100% of the coal bed methane wastewater plus a 100-year flood event, which means that the biggest event that you would have in 100 years would still be contained in this reservoir. So we're safe, right? Well, as you see in this photograph, there is water coming out of the reservoir. And that water is extremely salty. And that salt buildup and heavy metals that are all toxic moving into a very sensitive stream system called Muddy Creek that has some of the last populations of bluehead sucker, round-tailed chub, and flannelmouth sucker left in the state of Wyoming. And they're being polluted by this particular discharge. And every time I went to this spot, I took a photograph, and every time there was water coming out of the dam because the Bureau of Land Management couldn't live up to its promises. Fortunately, the rest of this project, based on all the scrutiny that this got, had to be re-injected underground. So instead of pumping it out on the surface and just dumping it and letting the solution to pollution be dilution, which is always a bad idea, which we learned in the 1960s, now they're actually having to inject it underground into aquifers of equal or lower quality, so you're not messing up the groundwater either. That's the kind of solution for this groundwater side of the coal bed methane project that really needs to be applied. Hydraulic fracking, this is the hot issue of the day because there are people in Wyoming who are getting their water wells poisoned by hydraulic fracking. There are people who, from Pennsylvania to eastern Colorado, who can light their tap water on fire because they're fracturing the rock and the fractures are propagating into their well water aquifers and the hydrocarbons are getting loose and they're moving into their personal water supply from their personal water wells. Now this is bad stuff from a number of different perspectives. There are some nasty compounds that go into fracturing fluids. The BTEX compounds are the big ones, the benzene, toluene, ethylene, and xylene. They even sound ominous, and they are. They'll give you cancer. They will kill you. It's really bad stuff. You don't want to be exposed to this stuff, yet they are pumping this underground as a means of creating these fractures. There are other things in fracking fluids as well, anything from diesel to cocktails that haven't even been disclosed yet. Right now in Congress and in the Bureau of Land Management, they're mulling over ways that they can require what's called disclosure. And the states of Wyoming and the states of Colorado now have a state-level ordinance that basically says you have to disclose to a greater or lesser extent what's in your cocktail of fracking fluids. Well, that's great. Now we're going to know what's poisoning us. But it's still going to be poisoning us. And why is this? It's because in 2005, under the Bush administration and with a Republican Congress, Congress passed the Energy Policy Act of 2005, which exempted oil and gas from the Safe Drinking Water Act. They don't have to comply. They can poison your water with impunity, and it's all legal because Congress made a loophole. And that's why this whole big fracking thing has taken off and has been poisoning well water across the continent. And we've been kind of powerless to stop it to this point because there is no law that prevents you from poisoning people's municipal water supplies with oil and gas drilling. Some other kind of activity, you'd be in violation. You'd be hauled into court, but not the oil and gas industry because they are more wealthy and they can broker the power, and so they get to be less accountable. That's something that I think should change. But at this point, the conversation's only about disclosure. It's not about what are we going to do to fix the problem and prevent them from doing this hydraulic fracking with at least the most toxic compounds. There are what's called green fracks where they're using water and sand. That could be required, but it seems unlikely that it would be given the amount of millions of dollars that are at stake here. Now let's talk about some of the sensitive wildlife species. This is a really sensitive bird here. You see how sensitive it looks? This is a golden eagle. This is one of our sensitive wildlife species. And it's sensitive to having intrusions close to the nest. And so if you have any kind of industrial activity or human traffic, foot traffic, vehicle traffic close to the nest, the eagle will be disturbed and you'll have lower nesting success. Elk, you folks probably know all about elk. There are 100 species. They associate trucks with guns and hunters. It's adaptive. If you see a truck, you run, you live longer. You have more babies. The elk are going to be like that in the next generation. So In Wyoming, they've done, this is the desert elk herd in the red desert, and they've done some studies and found that, lo and behold, elk will not use habitat within a half a mile of a road. So anytime you put a road through to a new oil and gas facility, you're not just wiping out that little roadway and that little pad for that drilling site, you're wiping out half a mile in all directions because the elk are not going to use that habitat because of the human disturbance. Sage grouse are the big one right now. I'm not shy at all of saying that Biodiversity Conservation Alliance was one of half a dozen groups that petitioned the sage grouse for listing under the Endangered Species Act. And a couple of years ago in 2010, the Fish and Wildlife Service determined, yes, it is warranted. It deserves listing, but we're going to preclude it because of higher priority. So right now it's on the candidate list with a requirement to come back in 2015 and make a final determination. But what this is doing is it's elevating the wildlife concern to an equal footing with oil and gas, so that they're having for the first time to consider sage grouse as a sensitive piece of, or sensitive type of wildlife that needs special care and consideration in order for us to keep it. Now, sage grouse are interesting because they breed collectively, and they come together at places called leks and dance and display and mate at these leks. And not only is the lek important for mating, but it's also the hub for all the nesting that occurs, which tends to happen within 3 miles of the lek site. So these are real hot spots for the sage grouse. And they have such strong fidelity to these lek sites that there was a dam that was constructed on the Gunnison River in Colorado. And they backed the water up and they flooded a lek site. And the next March, the sage grouse came out onto the ice to the exact spot of their lek site, and they bred on the ice of the reservoir. That's how hardwired they were to come to that one spot and breed. They're really, really instinctive creatures. And so these lek sites are really important. And in the past, the Bureau of Land Management would allow you to put a drilling rig as close as a quarter mile from these lek sites. And we found that in scientific studies that you could have a well that was drilling that was 3 miles away from a lek site, and it would depress the amount of sage grouse that were at that lek site. And if you had a producing well after the drilling rig had left, and all you had were some little boxes of equipment that were occasionally being visited by oil and gas workers every couple of days, if you had that within 1.9 miles of a lek, you would decrease the breeding population on that lek. And yet they were letting them come all the way up to a quarter mile. So that is starting to change as a result of this endangered species listing prospect. And so now we have what's called a sage grouse plan amendment that the Bureau of Land Management is undergoing that will modify every plan in the sage grouse range and install major restrictions on oil and gas within core areas. These core areas are going to cover hundreds of thousands of acres. They're going to radically reduce the footprint of oil and gas. And it's not only going to save the sage grouse, it's going to save about 350 other species of wildlife that are dependent upon the same habitats. Because the sage grouse is an umbrella species ecologically. If you save the sage grouse, you save a lot of different kinds of species that are dependent on the same kinds of habitats. The Wyoming pocket gopher, one of my favorites, there have only been 38 individual specimens of this species ever documented in the world. And 100% of the range of this species is within oil and gas projects that have been permitted or are in the permitting process today. In other words, the entire worldwide range could be one big well field because it's so compact. And yet the Fish and Wildlife Service decided this species didn't merit the protection of the Endangered Species Act because there really wasn't any proof that oil and gas development could hurt this species because it was underground. Well, if I'm underground and a 20-ton drill pit comes drilling down through me, I think I'm going to be affected, but that's just me. The ferruginous hawk is one of the hawks and eagles that's most sensitive. There are a whole suite of hawks and eagles that are very sensitive to oil and gas development and to the disturbances and human traffic and vehicle traffic that go along with it. When you have a nest site and you have a pickup truck that comes within half a mile of these nest sites for this species, the hawk will flare up off the nest, and it can be circling and circling until that disturbance leaves. Meanwhile, the eggs are down in the nest, and they could be cooking or they could be cooling. Or the nestlings could be in the nest, and they could be dehydrating. And it takes about 10 minutes for eggs to cook or cool to the point where they're not viable anymore. You've lost your reproductive effort for that couple for the year. And similarly with dehydration, that can happen within 20 minutes. So it doesn't take very much. It doesn't look like you're killing this animal. All it's doing is flying around. That's what it does naturally, right? But if it's off the nest and it's not taking care of its eggs or its chicks, then you could lose your entire year's reproductive effort. And these are what's called K-selected species. They don't have very large clutches. They don't have very naturally a huge survivorship of the chicks. They're barely replacing themselves. And they're territorial birds. It's not like they can breed like rabbits and fill the landscape full of hawks, because each one of them has hundreds of square miles of territory that it defends from all the other hawks. So every time you subtract a breeding effort, you're really putting a major dent in that population. So this is a species of concern, but really emblematic of many other raptors which may not be as sensitive, but certainly are sensitive to oil and gas development. The mountain plover, this is an interesting one. It used to be on the threatened list. Then it was discovered that instead of having 10,000 in the world, there were 12,000 in the world, so we could all relax because they're not going to go extinct. Well, I don't know what the population of Carbondale is, but you think about a town of 12,000 people. And if that's all the human beings there were in the world, wouldn't you be worried about our extinction? I would, because one bad thing happening could wipe us out. Well, the same thing happens with the mountain plover here. And interestingly enough, when the Fish and Wildlife Service under the Bush administration was taking the plover off the list, as they took it off the list, the mountain plover population in Utah went extinct because of oil and gas development in the 9 Mile area. Winked out. Even as they were saying, this animal is not at risk, it was going extinct in Utah. Mule deer are a fairly prevalent species and widespread, and yet they're not doing all that great in the West, and their populations are declining a bit. But when you put oil and gas development on top of all the other pressures that are facing this species, it really makes a radical difference. The Sublette County mule deer herd, there have been studies that have been done since they started oil and gas development. They have dropped in the area that's been developed by 60%. Neighboring populations dropped by about 12%. So oil and gas basically wiped out half of this herd by putting oil and gas development in what's called the crucial winter range. And what ended up happening is, when you put the oil and gas development in the crucial winter range, then the mule deer are moving out of that suitable habitat into less suitable habitat, into areas they never used for winter habitat before. The snow is deeper. The forage is less nutritious. They're not making it through the winter. They're not twinning. They're not having any success at all at carrying their fawns through to the next season. So, you know, many of these cascading effects can happen over the years. There can be time lag sometimes for 2 or 3 years before you start noticing you're losing your wildlife. But indeed, once these little cuts start adding up, you end up having major impacts on your wildlife population. The pygmy rabbit is one of my favorites. Good luck, you bunny huggers, hugging this one. You can hold it in the palm of your hand. It weighs less than 1 pound. It's an arboreal rabbit that lives exclusively in large, old, dense sagebrush stands along draw bottoms, and it climbs up into the branches of the sagebrush to nibble at the leaves. It is so shy of coming out from under the cover of that sagebrush that if you build an oil and gas road through one of these draws, you have just permanently separated the population on this side of the road from the population on that side, because they will not cross the road. Because if they cross the road, something's going to swoop down and gobble them up. So instinctively, they're going to stay under cover, and you know, from that perspective, any kind of linear disturbance that takes away the cover takes away their ability to disperse freely and then breed with their neighbors across the disturbance. There are a number of sagebrush obligate songbirds that have been shown to have negative impacts of oil and gas development, and one study by a guy by the name of Inglefinger in the Pinedale Anticline found that basically you had no nesting use of the lands within 100 meters or 300 feet of any road you build. And some of these fields are pretty dense, so when you have 300 feet on either side of the road and you have another road right across the way, then pretty soon you're blocking off most of the habitat. There are a number of rare plants, and rare plants have even more problems with oil and gas development because guess what? They can't run. And so these are some of the rare plants in Wyoming. At the top left, we have the desert yellowhead. It's on the endangered list. One population on the Beaver Rim, not so far from oil and gas development. That's pretty well protected. At the bottom, the blowout penstemon, we just got an area of critical environmental concern designated to protect that plant. It's on the threatened list as well. Exclusively lives in active dune field habitats, won't live anywhere else. And the top right is the Gibbon's beard tongue. And there are 3 populations in Wyoming. And I thought, you know, we must be the periphery of the population, but it turns out that in Colorado there are 2 populations that are much smaller, and that's the whole worldwide population. It's also being threatened by oil and gas development. It doesn't have much protection right now. Here are some Colorado rare plants. The Rocky Mountain Wild Organization knows a lot more about these than I do, but these are what are called oil shale endemics, and they are found on oil shale. Well, guess what? If you strip mine the oil shale, you're stripping away anything that this plant would be able to live on. So, impacts on wildlife. How do we classify this? I mean, if you look at these animals, I'm taking a picture of these animals. They look pretty happy. There's coal bed methane in the background. What's the problem? Well, every single one of these animals is in alert alarm posture. They've got their ears perked up like satellite dishes. They're not foraging. They're all frightened. All right, they're ready to run, and their cortisol levels are elevating in their bloodstream. It's all about, you know, the quality of their physiology, and whenever you have stress, it decreases the physiological condition of big game animals. So here I am disturbing these animals. Certainly, you run over them and they're dead, and there's an awful lot of traffic. We're talking tens of thousands of truck trips per year per well field. You're going to hit a lot of animals. The top left photo, the SkyTruth image, was taken after a single woman that was driving an oil and gas a condensate truck ran over a herd of about 20 antelope, killed all 20. So, one shot can have a significant impact. Habitat fragmentation is the big one. And you look at these photographs, especially these two aerial photos, the coal bed methane on the left, we're talking about 8 wells per square mile. The conventional natural gas on the upper right, you're talking about between 4 and 8 wells per square mile. And the industry looks at this and says, well, 3% of this habitat is destroyed. 5% of this habitat is destroyed. The other 95% is pristine. It's wonderful. But if you're an elk and you're not going to be within half a mile of a road, there is 0% of that landscape available to you. If you are a sage sparrow and you're not going to go within 300 meters of a road, there's 0% of this landscape that's available to you. It's a 100% landscape loss. Now I'm going to walk you through how it happens over time. This is the Jonah Field in 1986, before they started developing. 1999, about 300 wells. Then they went for another 3,100. Until basically you've got areas in this field, and here's an aerial photo, where the well pads virtually touch, and then in the inner spaces between the well pads, you don't even have any sagebrush left. It's virtually 100% destruction. This is that tight gas sandstone I was telling you about. We're working to try and get them to get some better solutions to this. Coal bed methane, of course, this is from the Powder River Basin. Habitat fragmentation, also a major problem in this area. At the bottom line, wildlife need wide open spaces to survive. And when you have major oil and gas development without major modifications, you're not going to get that. And by the way, for all of us that live in the West and like our quality of life, like our wide open spaces, like our view sheds, we're going to be affected by this too. It's not just wildlife. You know, we're a species too, and we're affected as well. So let's talk a little bit about some solutions to this oil and gas problem. First, I'll talk about some of the window dressing the oil industry likes to put forward. They like to talk about reclamation and how they have interim reclamation. So they start out with a 6-acre well pad, but they reclaim it back to a 1-acre well pad, and the rest goes back to native habitat. Well, here you see the native habitat. Okay, not going to support any wildlife with that. And then they have this idea of off-site mitigation. The industry came up with a cooperative sagebrush initiative about 3 years ago, and they said, well, yeah, we're going to nuke places like the Jonah Field and the Pinedale Anticline, but we're going to spend millions of dollars over here to enhance the habitat and increase wildlife populations over here, so you're going to have a net increase for wildlife. So we're going to have our oil and gas and our wildlife too. Isn't it great? Well, in the Jonah Field and the Pinedale Anticline, they have spent, as you can see, over $60 million in off-site mitigation. They have funded, to date, over 50 projects, individual projects of this off-site mitigation. How many wildlife populations have they increased? 0. I had a guy just a week and a half ago that came up to do a slideshow from the industry about the Cooperative Sagebrush Initiative, and I got to ask him, how many of these populations have you had an increase on? And he had to admit that there were 0. So the idea that you can spend $50, $60 million and make it all okay is just a mirage. And what ends up happening is that they do a bunch of projects somewhere else. They don't actually increase the capacity of the land to create wildlife. Maybe they get some conservation easements on ranches that are already wildlife habitat, And having that on paper in a deed in a courthouse does not change the wildlife habitat on the ground or make the sage grouse or the mule deer increase. It just keeps them at the same level. So you have a decrease in the well field and no increase elsewhere, so you have a net loss of wildlife. So what are the real solutions? Number one, drilling should not be allowed in crown jewel landscapes. There are some places where you simply should not go with industrial development. This is a new concept for the oil and gas industry, which wants access to 100% of our western lands. Places like the Jack Morrow Hills and Adobe Town, the upper parts of the Red Desert, are examples of that. In the lower left, the Wyoming Range is a place that did get put off limits to future leasing. And then in the lower right, there's the Roan Plateau, not so far from here. That's also a crown jewel landscape, but is still at risk from oil and gas development. Shouldn't have oil and gas development in any way, shape, or form in places like this. Second, if you have sensitive habitats that have these wildlife that can't cohabit with oil and gas development, you should be drilling beneath these habitats from off-site locations that are well away from the crucial winter ranges, the sage grouse breeding areas, the raptor nesting areas that are going to be disturbed. They can drill sideways for 7 to 8 miles, sideways, and hit targets the size of a bread box 2 miles underground. They can do this. It costs 10 to 15% more. Okay? These are the wealthiest corporations in the world with quarterly profits for a mid-sized independent that go $1 to $2 billion per quarter. They can afford this. They don't want to. Minimizing the footprint of the wells, roads, and pipelines is really important. We put out a report called Drilling Smarter in 2003, basically saying you can use this directional drilling technology to cluster multiple wells on a pad and have no more than one well pad per square mile on the landscape, radically decreasing the footprint of the pipelines, roads, and well pads, radically decreasing the habitat fragmentation, and leaving some habitat in between the well pads so that wildlife can survive. At first, the industry said we can't do it. Then they said it was too expensive and geologically infeasible. Now they're starting to do it as a regular process. But it took about 10 years of shaming to get them to start to move in this direction, and they're still not employing this on a routine basis to minimize oil impacts on wildlife. They're doing it mainly to minimize their cost by clustering their facilities at this point. Here's a point where we could raise the bar up off the floor and get a better result out of the industry. And of course, we need to minimize the impacts on air and water quality. CBM wastewater, this coal bed methane wastewater that's so salty, needs to be injected underground. Fracking fluids need not use these BTEX compounds. We need to have green fracking fluids if they're going to frack at all. And they shouldn't be fracking in areas that are the aquifers that are supplying water for folks. In terms of drilling and production, there are natural gas-powered rigs. There are electrically powered rigs that they can use as an alternative to these dirty diesel rigs that they use typically. They're more expensive, but they're better for air quality. And finally, you can require those green completions that require them to capture all that natural gas during fracking and drilling that they're just flaring off or venting into the atmosphere. These are things that can be done that are real practical solutions. Finally, we need ecoregional planning where we look at large-scale core habitats that get protected from industrial development and having oil and gas occur in the matrix where it can be sustainable for wildlife. And we need to connect these core habitats together so wildlife can move back and forth and can interbreed. Right now in the West, there still are large tracts of undeveloped land on our public lands and our private lands. It looks limitless. All you got to do is go east of the Mississippi to see where the future is. If we don't do something to protect what we have today, we're going to be fighting brush fires that we can't win on tomorrow. So we've got to get this together while we have something left to work with and really manage our lands intelligently with wildlife as a primary consideration if we're going to have these healthy ecosystems in the West that we enjoy today. So kind of at the end of the day, the real question is, will industry ever do it right on oil and gas? You have people like myself, people like the Wilderness Workshop, many other groups here working throughout the West to try and get the industry to do it right on oil and gas. We're starting to make some headway. We can't do it without your help. If you're not a member of the Wilderness Workshop, these guys are really great experts on oil and gas. They've got a guy by the name of Peter Hart that's a real leader down here, right here in Carbondale. Support these guys. Keep them going. We're outnumbered, we're outmoneyed, but we're not outgunned. And we're in there fighting for you. Thanks very much. Now, if you have any questions you'd like to ask, you know, I mean, each slide that I went through in this presentation was really about a 45-minute, 1-hour presentation in its own right. So we just kind of grazed the surface. So if you want to go a little deeper on any of these things, please do go.